Like many of you on Monday night, Amy and I were glued to our TV, watching the horrific news come through about the shooting at 2 farms in Half Moon Bay that took the lives of 7 Latino and Asian American farm workers. Over the years, for my family, and I'm sure for many of you as well, Half Moon Bay has long been a delightful place to visit. The beach air, the cute restaurants, pumpkin patches and farms for the kids. It's nearby. It's right in our backyard. This one felt close, too close. And that feeling was further compounded by the shooting in Oakland that same night, or the shooting that took the lives of 11 people just 2 days earlier in Monterey Park in Southern California, targeting the Asian American and Pacific Islander community that frequented the Star Ballroom Dance Studio. Compounded further by the other 39 mass shootings in 2023 alone. It is January 27th. And the terrible news coming out of East Jerusalem today of a shooting in a synagogue there taking the lives of at least 8 worshipers. It all feels like too much. Too much pain and suffering and violence. And it all feels somehow unstoppable or inevitable, like a fact we must accept. Gun violence is just a part of living in the United States of America. There's a post going around social media that captures the cyclical nature of this violence in which our country seems to be trapped. Some title it the Columbine effect or the cycle of gun violence in America. There's a mass shooting with major news coverage, followed by a general sense of outrage and elected officials and others that send their thoughts and prayers to the victims' families, followed by some elected officials who argue that it's too early to talk about gun control now, or maybe some gun laws are debated. And then life seems to return to normal until the next mass shooting starts the cycle all over again. In this week's Torah portion, we read of a different cycle of violence and destruction. In Parashat Bo, we find the last 3 plagues that led to the Israelites' freedom from slavery in Egypt. But putting the plagues aside for a moment, I want to focus on how the Torah explains Pharaoh's response to each of the plagues. I think it offers a powerful warning for us in this moment. If you're familiar with the story, you may be thinking of the cycle of the actions of each plague. Moses goes to Pharaoh, pleads with him to let the Israelites go free. Pharaoh says no. God sends a plague, and the cycle repeats itself again and again. For Pharaoh, each of these plagues do seem to catch his attention. And as they get increasingly more destructive, he does seem to consider agreeing to Moses' request, or at least some part of Moses' request in some of the instances. But as Nechama Leibowitz points out, the great biblical commentator, after each of the first 7 plagues that we read about in last week's portion, we read that Pharaoh's heart is either hardened, vayechazak lev paro, or Pharaoh remains stubborn, vayechabed et libo. Those verbs are powerful, chazak and kaved. His heart grew firm and heavy, suggesting that he somehow became incapable of sensing pain or misery, that he became more and more set in his obstinance. And as a result, his country and his people continued to suffer greater and greater destruction. In this week's portion, the language changes slightly. Rather than Pharaoh hardening his own heart, or his heart hardening itself after the plagues of locusts and deep darkness, we read that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. It's a troubling theological statement. Maimonides understands these verses as a warning. God did not force Pharaoh to choose evil, casting off each of the plagues as mere inconveniences. It was Pharaoh's own doing, over and over again. Once he persisted in his course of action, it became more and more irresistible. Reading this in a slightly different way, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who reads this through the lens of human psychology, teaches that one only gets so many chances of hardening their own heart before it becomes locked in, that our voice of conscience gets quieter and quieter over time until it's not even present. We find a powerful warning in Pharaoh's example here. If we get into the practice of hardening our hearts, of allowing ourselves to accept a given situation as just the way it is, then we risk losing our ability to even try to create change. We harden our hearts when we say to ourselves that the problem of gun violence in America is too hard or too big. We harden our hearts when we give in to the partisan rhetoric that gun violence can't be solved or that there's a lack of political will. We harden our hearts when we say it's too complex or too entrenched in the American psyche. We harden our hearts when we say to ourselves that this violence is just a byproduct of the times, then hunker down and hope that the next one's not too close. What will it take to crack open our collective hearts and demand that things must change? What would it take for us to imagine if it could be different? I know our hearts are breaking for the individuals whose lives were taken. As our tradition teaches, one who takes a life, it is as though they have destroyed the universe. And one who saves a life, it is as though they have saved the universe. It is overwhelming to think of the universes that have been destroyed by gun violence in this country. As Jews, we recognize the sanctity and godliness in every human life. And as Jews, when faced with trauma, we respond with hope. As we read in Psalm 30, we turn our mourning into dancing. Our tradition calls us to get to work, to not allow our hearts to become hardened and closed off from the suffering in the world, but to get to work to bring about change. We can call our senators and representatives. We can connect with organizations like the Reform Movement's Religious Action Center or Everytown for Gun Safety, making strides in advocacy. We can research the different pieces of legislation that have been presented over the years to require background checks or ban assault weapons. We can understand better why they have failed. We can talk to those who might think differently than we might, but who are also tired of this terrible violence, and start to find ways to work together to make our country safer. On this International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we Jews know the danger of what happens when enough people harden their hearts and remain silent. May our hearts break open tonight with the news of each of these tragedies, and may we continue to speak out and find ways to take action. Shabbat Shalom.